Thank you for joining me once again for another day text. Today is Thursday, March 21st, and we will be reviewing verses from the first chapter of James, as well as the second chapter. So we'll be reading verses 26 through 27 of James chapter 1, and then verses 1 through 4 of James chapter 2. So on these day text shows, we're working our way through the biblical books usually, but we also consider other texts. Right now we're in the book of James. And so as I mentioned, we'll be reading the final verses of chapter 1 and then the first few verses of chapter 2 as we continue our way through the letter. So I'm going to go ahead and get started so we can get right into the text material. I'm going to start with verse 26, and then I'll read verse 27, and then jump to chapter 2 and read verses 1 through 4. All right, James chapter 1, starting in verse 26. If anyone thinks he is religious or spiritual, but does not control his tongue, in reality deceiving his heart, such a religion is worthless. The way of worshiping, verse 27, that is clean and pure before God the Father is to take care of orphans and widows in their hardship, and to keep yourself stainless away from the world. All right, chapter 2, starting verse 1. My brothers and sisters, but he's writing to the brothers who are taking the lead at this time. My brothers, you must not maintain the belief about the glory of our Lord Jesus Christ with class distinctions. Verse 2. For if ever a man wearing gold and fine clothing enters into your synagogue, but then if a poor person with dirty clothing also enters. Verse 3. If you show you are more interested in the one wearing fine clothing, and you say, you must relax here in this comfortable spot. But if to the poor person you say, you must stand here, or you must sit under my footstool. Verse 4, are you not making distinctions between each other and showing you have become judges of evil thoughts? So, this is a very interesting section of text here because we start out talking about the type of religion. We're not talking about organized religion necessarily, like different groups, even our group. We're a group within Christianity, the Christian Witnesses of Jah. So, but what we're talking about here is the religious life or way of thinking that a person develops when they start to become more spiritual or associate themselves with spiritual ideas and people and things. However, you can think that you're religious in that sense, right? You associate with people who put God first, and you spend your time doing a lot of spiritual activities, including studying the religious texts and doing various things to assist others. But, so if you have that kind of religious exterior appearance, but we cannot control our tongue, our mouth, then it's worthless. It doesn't mean, we know that the tongue is like a fire, right? It's very hard to control, and it causes a lot of destruction because sometimes it gets the better of us and we say things that either we mean but shouldn't say, or we don't mean but we did say. So we have to watch ourselves. We have to speak truth, right? Sometimes we say things, they're not very nice or they don't seem pleasant, but they're true. There's nothing we can do about that, right? We can't always help the fact that what we say is based on the evidence that we have, and some people don't like it. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about whether or not a person can control their tongue in ways where everything they say or how they say and what they say is contradicted by the things that they otherwise do and teach. So it's really it would be a type of mentality, really, where a person is, like the text says in the parenthetical thought, deceiving your own heart. And you're really lying to yourself in a way that it doesn't match what you're otherwise representing. So you can see this in a lot of people, and even yourself and in myself at times, because we often put God first. But then we have to ask ourselves the question, Are we doing the things that God really wants us to do to put him first? Well, we want to praise God, we follow Jesus, and we treat others the way we want to be treated. Those are our three things. But in as part of those three things, treating others the way we want to be treated, following Jesus, we have to look out for people less fortunate than we are. Help other people who are in need. Now, there are some people who pretend to be in need, but they're just lying to you to try to get more from you than they otherwise deserve, or that their work or that their contribution would merit. We're not talking about that. We're talking about people who have a condition where they really are in need, and they're relying on others' goodwill to get through a difficult period, as well as Jah, of course. But in a human sense, sometimes we suffer because we lack the things that we may need in our circumstances. So it tells us here that the way of worship that God the Father, Jah, approves is to take care of orphans and widows in their hardship and keep yourself without spot from the world, or stainless. So when we find children who don't have parents, these are some of the most vulnerable people. Or when we find a widow, back in these days was much more difficult for women who didn't have a man or who lost their man, and they could not as easily maintain their standard of living as maybe today they could. So it was more difficult, and they had to look out for them in those ways, as well as keep away from the world, because the world is trying to constantly pull us away from Jah and into the things that really have nothing to do with helping orphans and widows or anybody praising Jah or following Jesus. They don't have anything to offer. They're not offering an alternative lifestyle that is better than this, better than the way we can be when we take care of each other and we praise Jah together. What is the world offering that's better than that? Movies? These movies, man, I'll get to those later. But there's nothing really there that they have that's in any way even approaching the kind of joy that we receive when we do these things. So now we can see the way that the God the Father wants us to worship, and that it has to do with taking care of those less fortunate than we are. But we also want to make sure that we are not making distinctions between people based on their material wealth. We recognize when a person has material wealth because you can tell in ways, and they've accomplished things that often require respect to some degree, but not to the degree that you would show partiality or favoritism in terms of the arrangement in your gathering, and how you could potentially prefer some rich person over a poor person, when really it should be the opposite in some way, because the poor person has less, whereas the rich person has more. So while we don't want to do the reverse of a distinction in a way that is unfair to a person with wealth, here come the cats. But it's not that way when we're dealing with things like this. Okay? We don't want to be preferential towards rich against poor either in a way that would be unfair. But when we're dealing with material items and conditions, that's often not going to happen when we show favor to the poor, because they have less, and so they're not as used to receiving these accommodations, the seating accommodations, whereas a rich person usually has the comforts and things that make them more accustomed to this treatment. And so you might think, well, they're used to it, I want to make sure they get the best spot. No. We take care of the ones less fortunate than we are first, unless there's some unusual circumstance, because we want to make sure those who are having a more difficult time, we give them more attention, so it's easier for them as they try to serve Jah and do what's right. So we want to make sure we are aware of these things, and rich people should be aware of that. You should be aware of the poor people among you who need your assistance. Now again, there are other people, they pretend to be poor, but they just lie so they can take your money and make you poor. You want to stay away from those people. You need to know who you're dealing with, okay? Even seemingly homeless people today, I see them a lot. And at times I've given them something and only to see them later acting in ways that contradict the way they're represented. So sometimes you can try to help people, but then they misrepresent what's going on and you're not really helping in the way you thought. So we take care of those we know have a condition they need assistance with, orphans, widows, people who are poor. But, the ones who are constantly involved in things that are criminal, they're hurting other people, they're not working hard, they're just scheming and lying all the time. Stay away from those people because they're going to get it times two, right? Because they like it so much. They like the crime and the lying and the stealing so much, they're going to get double in the reverse sense of their judgment because they cannot stop hurting other people for their own selfishness. That's not how we are. We like things we want to accomplish, but we want to help people in the right way. The people who really need it. Not people who can easily go work or who are just not that they're a woman who's single and they don't want a man even though they have children because they just don't want to have a male around to assist in the raising of the child. That's against the way God made us, okay? You have a lot of women today and men who abandon the marital arrangement or at least arrangements of people together. It doesn't have to be like an official marriage. The Bible doesn't talk about it that way. But when we're talking about it, an arrangement as a family, there are people today who abandon the best arrangement for their own selfish pleasure. And so they can do things the way they want to. And they just end up hurting their own children by depriving them of what they're supposed to be doing or what they should have as far as a family is concerned. But, today it's often more difficult in other ways because people pursue these material wealths and these ideas, these fantasies, really. And then they end up giving up the thing that matters the most, their family. And then they put their trust in people that they barely know or people who are involved in crime. And so how can you trust them? You can't. They're just going to turn around and do crime on you at some point. You just don't realize it. So you cannot work with people like that, okay? You have to try to find people who are like you, or at least decent enough to where they're not lying and stealing constantly. There's people like that. And they'll lie to you. They will pretend to be in a hardship. Just lie, openly lie to play on your feelings. So once you realize that is happening, that's the kind of person you stay away from forever. You don't go back to that person unless they apologize and they change. They have to transform from a lying, selfish person into somebody who's going to be honest and not constantly look for their own selfish benefit. You can't look after orphans and widows if you're constantly stealing and lying to other people. You can't. You can pretend to do it. You can maybe help someone here and there to ease your guilty conscience. You have to stop all this lying and stealing. And then you're not Robin Hood is what I'm saying, okay? You got people out there today thinking they're Robin Hood. They're lying and stealing from the rich, and then they go and they give to the so-called poor, which is usually just their own family and friends who don't want to work or do what's right, and so they just steal for them, thinking that they're like a Robin Hood. That's not what we're talking about here. We're not Robin Hoods, okay? We're Christians. We don't steal, we don't lie, we don't have to do any of those things. You know why? Because we worship God the Father. The Father will give you whatever you need if you really need it. I've seen it my whole life. It's only when I want something that I really don't need in ways that I then think, well, God, can you help me? And I realize, that's not really needed. I don't need that, and I should move forward in this way. So consider God the Father, the one whom we worship. And the way that he wants us to do so is by taking care of orphans and widows, staying away from the world and the people who lie and steal and then want to get you involved in everything they're doing. And if you don't, then they mistreat you some more. So prepare for that. When you're dealing with the world and people in it, they're not going to be favorable to you as you try to do these things to worship God the Father. They may pretend to look after orphans and widows, but they're not doing it in the way that is meaningfully associated with the worship and praise of Jah, in imitation of Jesus. And that's who we are, Christian witnesses of Jah. So we do those things. We try to anyway. We sometimes make mistakes, and we work on changing it when we need to get things right. So if you're not able to do as much of this right now as you can tell is important in a Christian life, think of ways that you can help orphans and widows. Think of ways you can help keep people and yourself away from the world and the destructive influence of all this garbage that they have out there. And I like entertainment. I like to do things. I don't like trash being dumped on me all the time. That's why I do the Hollywood garbage dumps. I feel like that's what they're doing, dumping trash on us. And I don't think they care. And in fact, when you look at these reviews and these other things that the world puts out, you can see why they use words like stainless. You know, it's like the world stains you. It puts this stain on you, this destructive influence in thinking. I mean, these movies are just concentrated forms of destruction, really, that then just get blasted into our minds and our thoughts. And it's difficult even doing some of these trailer reviews. I can't imagine people who are doing full movie reviews. I mean, you can watch a movie, but to actually sit and review it and break it down for an hour and a half, 2 hours of this trash. Boy, I'm glad I started with the trailers. It's about all I can take. Otherwise, I don't know if I'd keep away from the world. It would take me over if I had to sit there and watch these movies all day. The trailers. Okay, so we've learned a lot that we already kind of knew and that we can be reminded of now, and that is we want to be careful to watch out for those in need. Really in need, not liars and criminals who pretend to be in need. Real orphans and widows who are having actual hardship because of their stance and praise of Jah, and we want to help them. We want to help everybody we can, but especially those among us who are suffering because of the choices they made to worship Jah like we did. And don't make class distinctions. We can appreciate a person who has accomplished a lot and respect them for their achievements and wealth, but do not make distinctions. Do not show partiality to the rich person versus the poor. You never know, right? Like we learned when we went through Hebrews, you never know. The poor person could be a visiting angel. Who knows? Maybe the rich person too. And we will not know. They're not going to tell us. Not usually. So we should always be aware and mindful of whom we're dealing with. And try to be consistent, right? When we're talking about who we're dealing with, we're not talking about people in the world. We're not talking about being intimidated by criminals and people who think they're better than they really are. We're talking about angels and Jah and Jesus, who may come to us in the form of these types of people, and see how we act. So we never want to assume that things are always what they appear, but we should always approach them as they are what they seem, because we don't want to read into anything what's not there. Just be aware. You don't know who you could be dealing with. But if you're consistent in your treatment with people like this, it won't matter, because you'll be doing the right things. And then whoever they are will simply accept that that's what you're doing. Unless you're doing something wrong in ways where you're going to be judged, and then you get that too. So a lot of things happening. And I will be back, I believe, later today with another video or two. I'm working on different things. We're going to be headed towards open session this week. So this Sunday, remember, we're moving our Saturday shows to Sunday. Sunday, 8:30 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. We're going to do an open session this weekend, this Sunday. Talk about anything. I am going to lead the show, though, with a topic. I think at this point I'm going to talk about racism. I've wanted to do a CW Jaw Talk show on racism. I have a lot of very good thoughts, I think, and applications I can make. And I think people today get manipulated by racism all over the place. It's terrible. So I'm going to lead the show on talking a little bit about that, and then we'll move into your questions, different related topics, whatever. That's why it's open session. So again, I will be back, I believe, later today with some more videos, but I'm trying to get a lot of things done. Things are going well, so I appreciate your thoughts and prayers, and my same go to you. And I will be back tomorrow as we work our way through James chapter 2 for another day text. So I hope you will all join me tomorrow, 5 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, as we continue our way through the letter of James.